I'm Charlotte Alter, and I'm so happy to be joined by Representative Ayanna Pressley here today. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So obviously, this is Pride Month, and you've led your colleagues last year in observing the Trans Day of Remembrance. So I want to ask you, what specifically should Congress be doing to protect trans people, and especially trans people of color who are disproportionately at risk right now?
We should be doing for trans individuals what we should be doing for everyone, and that is ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to do more than just merely survive, which is what's true, and that's just barely for most trans individuals, but the opportunity to thrive. It means a life of freedom from fear. It means not facing discrimination when trying to rent a home, to buy a home, to be gainfully employed. And so what do we need to do? We need to do what we should be doing for everyone, and that is centering the voices and the lived experiences and struggles from our trans family and neighbors, and then working with them to develop the best solutions to ensure that they lead a life where they're thriving. And so one thing that we can do is pass the Equality Act, but
So tell me more about the Equality Act and what specifically it would do on this issue.
yeah, well, again, I live in Massachusetts, and it has been, one of the things that has frustrated me is that, that we are a pace setter when it comes to the fight for marriage equality. And there are many that, and then we had, we're a pace setter when it comes to the issue of public accommodation as well. And so I find that people would define the issue of equality by those two issues of marriage equality and in public accommodation. But our activism must continue because, again, discrimination persists because it is systemic and it is structural at every level. And that is why we have to ensure that, again, that there are no barriers to employment, to housing, to healthcare justice. When we say equality, we mean equality. That's a life, again, a freedom from fear and the equality of opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. I mean, it's really just as basic as that. It's just the thing that just comes up for me over and over again in all of my conversations with my LGBT friends and neighbors is just equality and freedom from fear, which so many live in. Being able to stand in your truth, to live your authentic life.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, how does COVID-19 exacerbate some of these existing inequalities? And what can be done about that?
Yeah. Okay, so first I just have to center, since it is Pride Month, and we did just have this Supreme Court victory, which again, it is disheartening that we have to legislate fairness. But since we are in Pride Month, I just want to first center history and just, talk about the role of Black trans women. We would not have an LGBT plus movement were it not for Black trans women who quite literally put their bodies on the line. And as Marsha P. Johnson reminds us, there can be no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us, right? And so today, members of the LGBTQ plus community continue to be disproportionately targeted, discriminated against. We see Black trans women being murdered at disproportionately higher rates. And so these injustices, again, that are structural, they're cultural practices, they're codified in lawmaking, certainly in the midst of COVID-19, for any marginalized community, which the LGBTQ plus community is, that hurt is going to be worsened and exacerbated. And so we knew anecdotally that these communities, that our communities would be hardest hit. But that's one of the reasons why I fought early on for the collection of data to ensure that there would be an equitable public health response when it comes to testing and when it comes to treatment, because we already know that these communities suffer from unequal access to healthcare, embedded biases within our healthcare system that will often ignore or delegitimize our pain. And we saw that playing out. And so, there's the comorbidities of structural racism and homophobia and transphobia. The only thing that COVID-19 could not kill was racism and homophobia and transphobia. And so that's certainly what I think COVID-19 has done. It has laid to bear and exacerbated those hurts and those inequities that already existed, particularly when it comes to access to healthcare. And because it has given that Black and Latinx communities have been more susceptible to contracting COVID. The virus doesn't discriminate, but we're more susceptible to contracting it. And then when we do, we suffer the worst consequences. And that has everything to do with living in subpar housing, being in proximity to environmental injustices, living in a food apartheid system, living in, all of these things. And so it's hard to speak about these things succinctly because they truly are all interconnected, which is why I think it's so important that our movements continue to be inclusive and intersectional, because our freedoms and our destinies are truly tied. If there's anything that we should have learned under the Trump administration, someone who is an equal opportunity bigot, offender, and abuser, is that we have got to all be in this together.
So on that note, I think this is a good opportunity to turn to the primaries that just happened this week. They're obviously still counting the votes, but it looks like Richie Torres and Mondaire Jones are likely to be the first openly gay Black members of Congress. How do you think the progressive movement has changed even in the last couple of years since you ran in 2018?
Well, it wasn't that long ago when I was running for the Boston City Council and, just being fully transparent because I don't know how to be anything else but that. The progressive movement didn't always seem inclusive. It was mostly, the progressive movement was not diverse. It was not inclusive or representative of marginalized communities. And so now you see that we are the face of that movement. And that makes sense because by very definition, the progressive movement is about progress. And so how can you make progress if you're not bringing everyone along, if you're not being disrupted, if you're not shaking the table, if you're not centering, holding space for everyone? And so these primary victories are exciting. They are emboldening. I'm a firm believer that the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power, driving and informing the policymaking. And again, against the backdrop of this administration, who's only been making this discrimination worse by actively and continually marginalizing members of the LGBTQIA community, launching attacks against their ability to access healthcare, enjoy parenthood, to serve in our military, and so much more. It's so important that we have folks that are willing to bring that representation and to ensure that we center those voices. So it's very exciting. Representation matters.
So I want to get back to something you said earlier about sort of how all of these movements intersect with each other. So what do you think? Obviously, we are in a period of immense activism around racial justice. How do you think the Black Lives Matter movement of the last couple weeks has shaped the results that we saw or that are continuing to come out from this week's primaries?
Well, these are old fights, but it's a new moment. And you do feel that we are in the midst of a reckoning and a paradigm shift. We have to continue to organize, to mobilize, to protest, to demonstrate. We have to be called out and to make sure that our movements are keeping pace with the hurt. And that means centering Tony McDade. That means that when we say their names, that we are saying all names, that if Black Lives Matter, that we're unapologetic and affirming that means Black trans lives matter, that Black LGBTQIA lives matter, and that we back that up. Because the only receipts that matter, hashtags and likes and retweets, that's cool and we appreciate solidarity. But what matters now is law change and budget change. That's what matters most. And so I do think that this uprising, which exists because, listen, for as long as there's unrest in Black lives, there will be unrest in the streets. The tipping point has been the most recent murders of unarmed Black folk. But that's not the only reason folks are in the street. They're in the street for every structural, systemic, racial injustice and hurt that has been targeted and very precise in its focus on Black Americans for centuries. This hurt is not organic. It has been legislated. It has been codified. Disproportionate hate, hurt, and harm hoisted onto Black communities born out of the original sin of slavery, from unequal access to the GI Bill, to Jim Crow, to the war on drugs, to redlining. And so we have to be precise and prescriptive in our response and in our solutions. And the early stages of the civil rights movement, which some people, I guess, thought we weren't still in, we are still in it. This is just a furthering and advancing of that work and that movement. If you look at the Montgomery bus boycotts, the Greensboro sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, those were respectively 6 months, 3 months, 392 days. What are we in, like 20 plus days? So the movement continues to grow. And I do think that momentum did help to that broad, deep, and diverse coalition that we see in response to injustice did help and support these incredible candidates in their races on the ground. It's a reckoning. It's a new moment. Again, old fights, but we're in a new moment.
So, on that note, you mentioned budgets and solutions. And one of the major demands of this movement is to defund the police. So I'm wondering, first of all, do you support defunding the police? And what does defunding mean to you? Does it mean reducing the budget? Does it mean abolishing the police altogether? What is your thinking on defunding?
Let me just say this, it's really frustrating, not only to have your culture appropriated, but also to have movements undermined. The legacy of community organizers is to build community. It is not to destroy community, which is why it was so frustrating in the early days of the Black Lives Matter protest in the wake of George Floyd, that there were infiltrators coming in to undermine that movement. And again, community organizers who honor that legacy of Black freedom fighters and writers before them is to build community, not to destroy it. And so I offer that to say that we can't allow the defund movement to be co-opted either. This is simply about a refund. This is about true reparations. This is about investment in communities. There's a reason why the Congressional Black Caucus submits an alternative budget every year, because we know that our communities have been historically under-resourced, underinvested in, and divested in. I remember in my early tenure in Congress, having just returned from the border, and there were votes that were imminently coming before us. And I said, I'm just so tired of the lives of Black and brown families and our children being moderated and put on a shelf. We'll get to you. And so that has certainly been true and reflected in our budgets. Now, I've been in Congress 2 years, but I'm not new to this work. I served on the Boston City Council for 8 years. And so I remember those unjust choices that were being hoisted upon me. And I would vote those budgets down. I was not going to choose between an accredited librarian, a paraprofessional, and a school nurse. Certainly if that meant that we were going to fund more school police than school nurses. And so, yes, I support the defund movement, because this is about the investment in our communities, which have historically been divested from. And let me just give you quick, 3 examples. Of course, our first responders have a role to play in society, but they need to play a role in every part of society, and they don't want to. So police officers don't need to come to the school because, 2 students are engaged in an altercation. If we make the investment in social workers and social emotional wellness, in school nurses and counselors and psychotherapists, we know what works. We know what supports our students in their readiness to learn and what makes learning communities safer. It's trauma-informed learning communities. It's restorative justice practices. It's teachers who will ask you what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. We know what works and we don't fund it. Why are we deploying the police when there is an individual who's battling mental illness? We should be deploying a mental health clinician. Why are our police officers administering Narcan when we should be investing in on-demand treatment substance use, and culturally competent care. So we know what works, we just haven't funded it. And so this is the reckoning. And so if you're going to affirm that Black Lives Matter, that means Black data matters. That means Black research matters. That means that Black home ownership matters. That means that Black students matter. That means that Black educators matter. And it means that Black lives being valued in our laws and in our budgets matter. And this is the time.
So I want to ask you about your bill to end qualified immunity, which you've worked on with conservative Justin Amash. So what was it like to work with somebody on this bill who you have a lot of differences with? There's a lot of places where the two of you are not aligned. I'm wondering if you can tell me where you see room for real bipartisan agreement on criminal justice reform, and also what it was like to work with Representative Amash on this.
Yeah, well, this actually isn't the first time that we've come together and done work together. He was supportive of my bill to abolish the death penalty, which is a tenet out of a larger piece of legislation that I introduced called the People's Justice Guarantee, a radical reimagining of our criminal legal system. And so we have already done work together. And on this, the issue of qualified immunity, and let me just say, yes, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, then you will support our legislation to end qualified immunity, these set of protections created by the Supreme Court and then really strengthened in court case after court case. If you believe that Black Lives Matter, then justice for the Black lives that we have been robbed of matters. Although I have to acknowledge that true justice would be that George Floyd and Tony McDade and Breonna Taylor, or even locally in my own district, Burrell Ramsey and Terrence Coleman would still be alive. But if there cannot be true justice, there must be accountability. And ending qualified immunity would ensure that, because no one should be above the law, including law enforcement. No one should be above the law. If you are a lawyer and you violate someone's civil rights, then you can be taken to account for negligence. If you are a doctor, you can be sued for malpractice. And so, if people are going to operate, if law enforcement who have taken a vow to serve and to protect, and I'm leading with I should lead with the protect and serve, that's the point. To do that, they should not be operating with reckless impunity and callous disregard for human life, for Black lives, without any retribution or any consequences, without any justice. And so, our bill has to pass to eliminate these protections.
Congresswoman, so you've mentioned that we need to be precise about addressing this issue. So what are some of your recommendations for how best to address police brutality?
Okay, so I've already introduced a congressional resolution to condemn police brutality, racial profiling, and excessive use of force. I do believe in this moment that congressional intent is a powerful tool. We've used it as a values frame when it comes to foreign policy. And in this moment, Congress must act as the conscience of our nation. So I do think going on the record on that is very important. And Senator Warren and I, we've introduced the Andrew Kearsey Act, which would require police and correction officers to provide medical care to people in need that are in their custody. And that was directly born out of a conversation that myself and Senator Warren had with surviving family members who've been robbed of their loved ones due to police brutality or due to medical negligence, or what I would consider criminal negligence. And so that's what happened. Mr. Kearsey, Andrew Kearsey, a father of four, he was in police custody. He was saying that he couldn't breathe, that he was experiencing intense chest pains, and there was no medical intervention, no ambulance was called, and he died of cardiac arrest. And so that's what the Andrew Kearsey Act would address and hopefully prevent any future tragedies, even when we saw with the Rayshard killing in Atlanta, that after he was murdered, that officer was picking up shell casings instead of even checking for the medical state of Rayshard. So, I mean, again, the stuff runs so deep in terms of the dehumanization and the objectifying of Black and brown bodies. And so I do think by ending qualified immunity and then passing the Andrew Kiersey Act, that does get us closer to progress. Not to justice, because justice would be them all being alive still, but it does get us closer to progress. Federal, state, and municipal.
Yeah. So I want to talk about leadership for a second, because as you mentioned, the civil rights movement was very long. There was a prolonged period of activism. One big difference between this moment and the civil rights movement is that in the 1950s and 60s, there were a handful of very clear and visible leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and Rosa Parks. And this movement that we're experiencing right now is much more leaderful and is structured in a way that allows anybody to take up the mantle, anybody to participate, anybody to be a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement or to start a demonstration anywhere in the country. Why do you think the movement works this way, and what are the benefits and drawbacks of that structure?
Yeah, the benefits is that if you have an equality of opportunity and activism in movement and in coalition building, then you don't have to deal with what we often dealt with on the back end was in the absence of those leaders, have you appropriately, mentored or succession planned, who will stand in the gap? And so no movement should rest on the shoulders of any one person or individual that flies in the face of what a movement is. It is about the masses. It is about community. It is about coalition. And so I think that's a good thing. And I think that's why it will be more sustainable. Because, this work, as rewarding as it is, it can certainly be depleting. And so when you have a movement that's this big and this strengthened and this multi-generational, I think it supports the restoration of everyone while doing this work. You can't pour from an empty cup. I know many times when I have been tempted to curl up in a fetal position just from the gravity and the scale and the scope of the hurt, to go out there and to be in community and to be a part of a movement. And what the early days of the civil rights movement taught us, they gave us the blueprint. You're not just organizing for the sake of organizing. The whole point is to organize, it is to mobilize, and it is to legislate. And so I'm very grateful for the support of many of those movement builders who do support the bill introduced by myself and Representative Amash to end qualified immunity, to get us one step closer to justice and accountability.
So when I talked to Jess Morales-Ricchetto and Jessica Bird a couple of weeks ago here on TIME100 Talks, they talked about the importance of non-Black allies participating in this movement. So I'm wondering how your friends in Congress have been supporting you. And, over the last couple of weeks, have you been texting with other members of the squad, and what have those conversations been like?
Sure. Well, we're sisters for real. So yes, we have a text thread and we're in communication all the time. And one of our sisters recently lost her father to COVID, Representative Ilhan Omar. So we're in regular communication about the work and about each other's lives, and trying to make sure that we stay fortified, for the many fights that we're in and that are ahead of us. So far as my colleagues that are not people of color or not Black, specifically, sure, a number of people have reached out just to check in, to offer their support or to ask questions. I introduced a resolution within hours of the murder of George Floyd. And the resolution was a congressional resolution to condemn police brutality, racial profiling, excessive force, the militarization of our police. And several members reached out just wanting me to better define for them, what does demilitarization mean? And they come from different districts, certainly share my values, but just wanted to better understand, those tenets and what that meant. So there's a lot of conversations like that. And I appreciate that people are asking the questions. This is a moment, if you're going to truly be woke, experiencing some epiphanies in this moment about just how pervasive and systemic the hurt has been disproportionately for Black Americans, you have to ask questions. And so, I would just say what I've said to them, which is, at this moment, we need you to be more than allies. And I appreciate your acknowledging your power and your privilege, but we need more than guilt. We need more than hashtags and likes and retweets. This is, again, about law change. This is about budget change. We're in the midst of a culture shift, but what we need to see is a power shift. And that, again, has everything to do with representation and who's around policy and decision-making tables, as much as it is about the laws that we pass and what we invest in our budgets and who we invest in our budgets.
So speaking of who's around the table, it looks like, as I mentioned earlier, it looks like Jamal Bowman is very likely to be joining you in Congress next year. Can he be in the squad?
Well, we have the same haircuts, so I'm certainly open. but what I will just say is that, first of all, I was very proud to endorse Jamal in his candidacy, and the squad is certainly bigger than any 4 members of Congress. Those are my sisters, and we have a tremendous kinship because we've walked a unique path in being first, those unique joys and pains, and we certainly have shared values. But at the end of the day, anyone doing the work of building a more equitable and just world is a member of the squad. Oh, and if you can wear this lipstick shade, so you're in too.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Come on.
Well, Representative Pressley, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you have a great Pride celebration.
Thank you.